All right, it's the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone remotely from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Shannon Connors, and today we have Eric Clark, the lead wildlife biologist for the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, and Keith Karnes, the forest director for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, presenting forest management for culturally significant wildlife. Thank you everyone for tuning in today for our webinar series held in partnership with the National Climate Adaptation Science Center, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'll turn things over to Stephen Handler just real quick to give us a little more information on the Forest Ecology Working Group.
Hi everybody, my name is Stephen Handler. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. I just want to offer another welcome to this webinar and hopefully to the entire webinar series if you're just catching up with our catalog, or those of you who have been with us all along. You know, this webinar series is being brought to you by several partners, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Forest Ecology Working Group, Science Applications and Migratory Birds Programs, and the National Conservation Training Center. And then partnering with the Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, making this webinar series possible. Big thank you to folks in the background who have really helped us achieve this great series, Jim Siegel and Jeff Horan. Thanks.
All right, thanks so much, Stephen. And we've just got a few logistical details to go over here before we introduce our speakers. So just as a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. This webinar is being recorded live and all of you are active participants. Whether you're listening by phone or computer, you are currently on mute during the presentation for the enjoyment of others. If you have a question, please enter it using the chat box and be sure to choose to send the chat to everyone. And feel free to enter questions at any point during the presentation. We will pause to take questions about halfway through as well as at the end of the webinar. And this presentation is being recorded and will be available within about a week or two after the live presentation. And if you wish to change your presentation view, you can access different view modes in the upper right-hand corner of your screen as shown here on this slide. And that's all I have, so I'm now going to turn things back over to Stephen again to give us a little bit more information on the webinar series and to introduce our speakers. Thanks, Stephen.
Sure, thanks, Shannon. So those of you who have been with us all along, you already know this information, but if you're just coming to us today for the first time, what we wanted to do over the course of this 12-part webinar series was really to tell a story that is kind of arcing throughout the entire calendar year now that we've been doing these webinars. And that's to tell a story about climate change and its impacts on forest ecosystems and forest-dependent wildlife species. We started out really with the building blocks, with some introductory presentations about climate change and its effects on ecosystems, its effects on wildlife, its effects on some of the functions of forested ecosystems, like the carbon cycle. We got into more detail then about different adaptation practices, different ways to examine climate change vulnerabilities of forest ecosystems and forest-dependent wildlife. And now we're nearing the end of the series. Next slide. And so I've been looking forward to this one for a long time, ever since we put the agenda together. I've been waiting now for a year, it's hard to believe, to hear Eric and Keith give this joint presentation on climate adaptation strategies for culturally significant wildlife. I've had the pleasure to work with Eric and Keith over the years, and I know they'll both do a fantastic job. So I'll introduce both speakers now briefly. And so starting with Eric, Eric is the lead wildlife biologist for the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians in the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan. Eric is the kind of guy who can't seem to say no to additional responsibilities. So he's also a PhD candidate. He's also co-leading the Center for Cooperative Ecological Resilience at Michigan State University. And I'm sure if anyone else has another role in mind for Eric, just ask him and he will say yes. Next slide. And then Keith Karnes is the forestry director for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe in northern Minnesota. Keith is shown here halfway through a bottle of toxic slime, which looks really healthy for you, Keith. And I'm excited to hear him talk about cooperative management that they've been doing for quite a while now with the Chippewa National Forest and on Leech Lake Band reservation lands. So thanks to both Eric and Keith. We'll start with Eric teeing us off for today.
Thanks, Stephen. I am going to try to do this and see if I can make it work. All right.
That looks good. We're seeing your
That
slides.
looks good. I was going to say, are you seeing my presenter screen? Okay. Yeah. So thanks a lot for having me here today. I too have been looking forward to this for a year. And in fact, when Stephen notified us that this was approaching, I had to go back and remember what the webinar was about. Not really. I've been paying attention all along. But anyways, I want to talk a little bit about our work with the Hiawatha National Forest, focused on developing adaptive approaches to co-stewardship and remnant boreal forest ecosystems. So just as an overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about Sioux Tribe and our wildlife program. I want to talk about boreal remnant forest ecosystems, and then co-stewardship and adaptive management focus and why we have that. And then I'll talk a little bit about our work in action. And so without too much description, the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians is has the largest population east of the Mississippi of any tribe in the US. We have around 53,000 members. Annually, we issue around 55,000 licenses to our members to harvest across the fish and wildlife species across the 14 million acre-ish 1836 treaty ceded territory. And the map on the screen on the right shows a rough distribution of our membership across the state of Michigan. And so you can see we have a really broad membership. So why do we focus on boreal forest ecosystems or remnant boreal forest ecosystems? And I guess first I'd like to just define what I mean by that. And really we're talking about conifer dominated ecosystems that make up that discontinuous trailing edge of the boreal temperate biome ecotones. And this map here, taken from Brandt in 2009, I think demonstrates or shows what we're talking about pretty clearly, as he puts it, the hemiboreal region. For Anishinaabe cultures, it is so inextricably linked to the species and the ecosystem that make up this region. So many of the clan species and the cultural meanings behind those relationships are tied directly to these ecosystems. And it's also, by definition, that trailing edge, we're seeing these ecosystems sort of march northward. And there's a lot of aspects of these that are highly vulnerable to climate change. And yet I think we have lots of opportunities to think about the way we manage ecosystems, in particular forest ecosystems in this region, and actually change the trajectory and help us maintain connections to some of these species. And it's really hard to overstate how important it is for Anishinaabe cultures to maintain those connections to these species because of these long-standing relationships that they have with them. So why do we focus on adaptive management? I think it's a really good tool for a lot of different reasons. This stuff is taken directly from the DOI applications guide. You know, adaptive management is really good for dealing with dynamic natural resource systems that, you know, have lots of, we know lots of things about them, but there's also lots of noise in our understanding, I'll say. And really one of the things that I think makes it really useful in the context that we work in with agencies like the Hiawatha National Forest or the state of Michigan is that, you know, it really focuses on using management interventions as experimental treatments, you know, and it helps us build data to understand how our management treatments are changing the system over time. And so, you know, really, I think, you know, in this more specific context in the work we're doing with the Hiawatha National Forest, it's a really useful tool to sort of incorporate both Anishinaabe community knowledge and Western science information, as well as, you know, the structured decision-making by definition should be inclusive, and it provides a really nice framework for us to think about broad groups of partnerships and perspectives. And I think you'll see how we use it. I think it provides a really nice, useful framework for co-stewardship of federal lands. Well, probably any lands that we are going to co-steward, but in this case in particular. You know, why do I guess to think about co-stewardship and why we are really heavily focused on that in our program. You know, as I said, Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians issues 55,000 licenses to our 53,000 member tribe, and under the auspices of the 2007 Inland Consent Decree, we have shared rights to all of the public lands in that in the 13 million acre ceded territory, which I think there's roughly 4 to 5 million acres there. And so really coming up with ways to collaboratively manage those shared resources across those, you know, 4 million acres is really important. And we have some legal frameworks that provide that necessary underpinning. And so co-stewardship is a really important tool for us to think about advancing tribal priorities across not just the 1836 ceded territory, but really broadly at the regional or national level as well. So now I'll talk a little bit about our work in action. Since about 2011, I believe we've funded 12 different projects, and I think that might be up to 16 now. Actually, I should have updated that slide, with the Hiawatha National Forest that are really focused on boreal remnant ecosystems. In that time, we've put over $1.6 billion in assessment work on the ground, really trying to understand how these ecosystems work and how we can build good baseline data to evaluate our methodologies. And as I said, all of this work has sort of been developed with an eye towards building those baseline information sets so that we can evaluate our management prescriptions over time. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, or I guess I'll talk the rest of the time about a very specific example of where we've been working with fire or Ishigode and Anishinaabe Moan in these boreal remnant ecosystems in partnership with the Hiawatha National Forest. This is a project that we started in 2018, I believe, and we're really focused on the Rako and Bachelor's Marsh land type associations in the Eastern Upper Peninsula. These are ecosystems where fire is a very dominant force. There's a well-known long history of Ojibwe use of fire, and as well as hunting and gathering activities, and it's in close proximity to both the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. They're sort of center in Sault Ste. Marie, as well as the Bay Mills Indian community in Bay Mills. And it also aligns, this area aligns with a lot of work that we've done in the past. So it was sort of a nice, convenient place to work, given that There was a NEPA assessment done for this landscape that had over 9,000 acres of prescribed fire in it. And we had already collected a lot of information on wildlife species use in this area. So our approach in this project was really to focus on utilizing both Anishinaabe and Western science methodologies to understand the impact of current fire management, and then evaluate new prescriptions with these alternative science perspectives, and then to create a plan to enhance both fire safety and ecosystem resilience as we're doing this. So really, at the end, we developed this plan that consisted of 3 components. The first component was just the actual stewardship plan. And we also developed a community engagement framework, as well as an ecological monitoring framework. And so the goal of this, or I guess the objective here with this plan, was to really develop something that the U.S. Forest Service, as they were going about their business of implementing fire, could look at alternative ways in coordination with the tribe of sort of alternative to business as usual fire prescriptions, I guess. And to really think about, can we build this plan so that it has the ecological framework pieces and the community engagement framework pieces cooked into it, so that it wasn't, the fire planners could do it easily. So through this process, we did a lot of data collection on the ground. We really focused on trying to understand how Ojibwe shape and maintain local boreal forest ecosystems. To do that, we used, I say we loosely, this was really a bunch of work that the Forest Service did, but looked at dendrochronology and peat core stuff to really understand the fire history of those ecosystems. And then we spent a fair amount of time working with sort of community knowledge holders here in Sault Ste. Marie and in the surrounding area to collect oral traditions around fire and try to understand it from that perspective. So we on that community engagement front, we really focused on collecting community knowledge through sort of really trying to understand the fire ecology relationships in the history, with focus on specific species of interest. We contracted with the Intertribal Council of Michigan to do a bunch of semi-structured interviews with elders and community knowledge holders. We did storytelling events, those baboon gatherings, which are winter storytelling events where we brought people in and brought storytellers in and talked about fire and its importance. And then we actually brought people out in the field, folks from, elders from the Sioux Tribe Traditional Medicine Program and harvesters. We actually brought them to these sites where we were planning fire and talked to them about that and sort of elicited their perspective on that. And so through that process, I think we actually learned a lot, and it has sort of formed the basis for how we're going to move forward a little bit different. But it was really interesting and powerful to understand that Anishinaabe perspective of fire it's a living being with a relationship to people. They identified 62 individual wildlife and plant species, identified 10 different locations where they felt like we could use fire, and we discussed lots of different perspectives on seasonality, intensity, and frequency of fire. The field ecology work that we did over the 3 years that we were working here, we put over 18,000 trap nights on the ground in this 40,000 hectare landscape. I won't go through all these things, but we collected a lot of data on a lot of stuff, and we leveraged, as I said earlier, a whole bunch of data about wildlife use in these areas that we had existing, and really tried to leverage this in the space for time substitution framework, where we could evaluate past fire on the landscape and then use that as the baseline data set for evaluating future prescriptions. And so just to give you an example of what that kind of looks like in action, this is a bunch of, to connect to Keith's talk a little bit later, this is a bunch of information on snowshoe hare that we collected in this landscape. You can see this is the Hiawatha National Forest here, and I just wanted to provide a little detail. These pink points are GPS points from a snowshoe hare. The blue points are trap points. These were all part of a spatial capture recapture study that we are just finishing up. And one of the things that we found as our top model in there is that the percentage of the landscape that's in upland conifer, and in this case, which is really mature jack pine and red pine plantations, as well as the edge density within a half a kilometer of all these sites, were the biggest determining factor of snowshoe hare abundance, or explain the most variance in those. We also have done a lot of occupancy based sampling across this region. And you can see a quote there at the bottom, which is from one of our elders talking about snowshoe hare habitat in this area. And so in practice, this is actually some excerpts from the Ishkode plan, where in the Bachelor's Marsh ecosystem, we're focused on, their sort of broad ecosystem objectives, which I think connect very nicely to those perspectives, where we're focusing on reducing woody encroachment in wet areas, looking at opportunities to create cedar and hemlock regeneration, and then identifying places to promote late seral forest at fine scales. And at the same time, looking to increase biological and structural diversity, specifically in red pine plantations around there, which there's a lot of. And then to more broadly engage Sioux tribe members in assessing, plant response and habitat monitoring activities through site visits and harvest reports. And then to drill down even more in that plan, we actually have specific snowshoe hare management objectives that focus on, obviously increasing the quality and quantity of hare habitat, but to do so through increasing landscape heterogeneity. The early successional jack pine, or jack pine thickets, I guess we call them, and the amount of woody understory for horizontal cover. And to do that through using fire with a focus on sort of small scale, low intensity burns. Oops. So moving forward, we are actually, I think, pretty close to signing a Tribal Forest Protection Act agreement with the Hiawatha National Forest that will actually make building or co-stewarding these remnant boreal forest ecosystems a long-term agreement and sort of partnership opportunity for us moving forward. We have a lot of new partners that we're working with. We've got some postdocs starting at the University of Michigan, as well as PhD students who are working in this area, looking at the intersection between fire, wildlife, and vegetation. And then hopefully starting this year, we'll actually start putting fire on the ground in the Bachelor's Marsh ecosystem, which is the place where I think we have the most robust baseline data set. And then we're really starting to look at how do we apply this stuff to new landscapes. So with that being said, I'd just like to say thank you. And I'd really like to acknowledge all of our Sioux tribe and Anishinaabe community members who generously donated their time, their energy, spent time in the field with us, as well as our awesome partners with the Hiawatha National Forest, including Eric Kopitsky, Brenda Dale, and Paul Thompson. So thank you.
That was great, Eric. Thanks a lot. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I'll give you one quick one and then one slightly more detailed one while we're switching topics here. So Eric, you used a little bit of Ojibwe in your presentation, and there was a question about Adazukanen. What is that word?
Those, I think you could, so those are really the creation stories, the Ojibwe creation stories.
Okay. And now maybe a little more meaty question. So when you're thinking about your work, what situations initiate adaptive management consideration?
So if you know me, it's something that I talk a lot about. And so I think really anytime where you have a system where you have a lot of uncertainty in how it's going to respond to some management action that you're going to take, you've got a prime candidate to start thinking about adaptive management. And I think there's maybe thinking about adaptive management is a very specific situation with structured decision making. But I think when you have, I think a lot of times when you've got multiple competing values and lots of uncertainty in a system, but you do have some control over what you can do, adaptive management is a good framework, or a good sort of decision analysis framework to be thinking about.
I'm sure we're going to come back to that. We have a couple follow-ups, but just in the interest of time, we'll leave that as a cliffhanger for folks. And I'll invite Keith to come on the video screen here and share your presentation with us.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Let's see here. So, like Eric had mentioned, I mean, they're getting ready to move into a Tribal Forest Protection Act for snowshoe hare and boreal forests. I'm going to start my talk on our snowshoe hare pilot project through the Tribal Forest Protection Act. And that stemmed from just a quick conversation with our wildlife biologist. And we were doing Tribal Forest Protection Acts for red pine thinning, for white spruce thinning, and then for aspen acreage reduction. And he had asked me, well, I wish I had something that I could use. And I said, well, if it's a forest issue, you can use it. And so I told him, you should pursue something like this. And so we did. And let's see here, how do I switch slides? Oh, there we go. So, I mean, the first thing is, what is the Tribal Forest Protection Act? And it was created by Congress in 2004. It came out of fires burning off of public land, BLM lands largely in California, and burning over rancherias. So a lot of it is for protection. But somebody in their eminent wisdom, when they drafted this act, they put a small caveat in there that you could also use it to improve land in need of restoration. So we were very cognizant, that climate change is negatively impacting the snowshoe hare. And the most obvious one, as a forestry director, is when we get snow on the ground, a lot of times the snowshoe hare is still brown. And my wildlife guy kind of explained it to me that snowshoe hare are probably not the brightest individuals on the planet. And they will just stop if they see a predator and figure the predator can't see them, and then they're just easy prey. It's a keystone species, so the benefits of creating snowshoe hare habitat, it far exceeds just the little bunnies themselves. Historically, they were a food source for tribal members and numerous keystone species as well. So you'd ask yourself, what is hare habitat? And that's what we were doing. And you can see one right there. We were finding them a lot of times down in the lowland cedar where nobody is doing any active work, really. Cedars falls victim to deer browse, so everybody just kind of leaves it. So there's a lot of horizontal structure and low cover. So they tend to hide in there. And this map kind of shows exactly what I'm talking about. We would find larger populations of snowshoe hare in these center cedar swamps. And then you can find one trickling out here and there, but once they've moved into the secondary habitat, there's usually not enough cover because of overharvest and overutilization of the slash. And they just didn't have a place to live, and they would get picked off. So the populations could never really truly increase because they would be at max capacity in some of these areas. So what we tried to do is find some areas of key core habitat and then do a TFPA to try to link them together, you know, to allow for some secondary habitat structure inside those areas. And this is the actual area we came up with. There was snowshoe hare up in this area. This is a large cedar swamp. So we proposed doing some thinning in a white plantation here, a red pine plantation here. And as we were doing the thinning, we wanted the logger, as part of his logging contract, to come and create piles. And these piles, they wanted them about 20 feet apart. Our wildlife department wanted them 20 feet apart. And we had to negotiate that. I mean, it was, especially in time, there just wasn't enough slash to do that and do it effectively. But we did get piles in there. And the promise would be to link them down to this cedar swamp down here. Now, the problem with this is we submitted it in 2016 and it was approved in 2017, but the work didn't get done until 2022. As we all learned in one of the grades when we were in school, you know, the whole predator-prey relationship, the populations that were in here, they crashed before this work was done. But we'll get back to that. Going on right now that we call the Reserve Treaty Rights Lands Grant, where I'm going out into fire dependent red pine plantations, and we are removing the hazel. We're cutting the hazel down. And a lot of these areas, much like that map you just saw on the previous page, they're adjacent to some of these areas, you know, so they would count as secondary habitat, but we can't promote it through the grant because it's a fuels grant, and putting these piles out here, it wasn't necessarily met well to keep the fuel in little compact areas, you know. But what we did do is say that they have fluctuating, changing conditions, you know, where in some years you're going to find some snowshoe hare are going to want to kind of explode into secondary habitat over in this one area, but not over here, but they'll come over here after these are done, et cetera, and so forth. So now we have done other TFPA projects on the lake reservation. You know, you can see on the top here, we got our snowshoe hare habitat expansion, but we've also got approved TFPA projects for aspen reduction, red pine and white spruce thinning, where we did a pilot and then moved it to full scale, which we have talked about doing for the snowshoe hare. And then we also have a fire ecology restoration project. And something I've learned over the years is, I mean, people have a tendency to silo. So, I mean, we've talked about these projects, and can these projects work for wildlife as well? Because it's about restorative ecology, and you can get into a whole philosophical conversation about what does ecology all entail. So, I mean, this was provided to me by my wildlife biologist. Woody material and snags that you're going to find in the woods. Now, some of these, they certainly look like mesic forests to me. This is probably fire dependent, and I would wager this is as well. But in the mesic ones, you know, we figure we can use the aspen TFPA. It was approved and signed in 2018. And if you look at the acres that there is of Chippewa National Forest land inside the Leech Lake Reservation that are categorized as aspen, it's over 72,000 acres. That was then. It is now over 73,000 as we're just now getting ramped up to truly start working on this large scale project. And this is a map of where they're all located. The blue line on the outside indicates the Leech Lake Reservation boundary, and you can see all this aspen, this fragmentation and early successional species that are existing here. And every agency around here, you know, they basically voice that they have too much aspen, but it's a difficult problem to remediate, and everybody just want to kind of pass it down the line. So what we're seeing with the aspen presented on the landscape, I mean, because of its aggressive coppice nature, it decreases the forest diversity. And if climate change projections and Stephen can correct me afterwards here, but I believe it's quaking aspen is expected to migrate out of the area. That's the best projections that available science has come up with. And if we had to pick an aspen type that was up here, quaking aspen, I would wager is about 90% of the aspen we have on this landscape. So throughout, we're on third, sometimes even fourth harvest, and it just becomes non-representative of the native plant communities in the area. You know, our wildlife guy, he presented this to me as well. You know, harvest has to be more than just maximizing the revenue. You know, there have to be all these other intrinsic benefits that need to be in there. Do we need 10,000 stems? Why can't we burn areas if it's fire dependent? And he wanted to, can we make the site not so ugly? And obviously beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but most of the time, I mean, the general public, they look at something like this and ask, can't you do better? Now, this shift in aspen management, utilizing Minnesota's native plant community classifications, we broke it down into two categories, you know, just to make things as simple as possible. In the mesic hardwood native plant communities, we're just saying if the percentage of aspen that makes up this forest is just mature aspen, but at a fairly low percentage, just let it senesce, let it fall over, let the natural succession occur. It's going to give you your horizontal structure. It's going to give you your growing space for these other species. But if it's in a fire dependent native plant community, we're saying, we think your best winter is harvest it, be vigorous about it, burn it, and then start putting in the species that would make reminiscent of a native plant community fire dependent system. And my wildlife guy, apparently he gave me a lot of these slides, and he was showing me, you know, pictures of blowdown, pictures of some stand replacing fire that results in some of this horizontal structure. He said snowshoe hare can thrive in conditions like this. I don't know that we can get a condition exactly like the bottom one with the fire, or if we want to leave a condition exactly like we have with the blowdown. But these are ideas to think about. You know, I can say we can't do this, but I would expect our wildlife guy to say, well, why not? And he's justified in asking that question. So we move into our pine spruce thinning TFPA project. And these are the areas that we had that were inside the Chippewa National Forest, which is kind of the orangish yellow boundary line. And then the gray line is the Leech Lake Reservation. 90% of the reservation is inside the forest, and all the red shape files show red pine plantations that were 20 to 40 years old. All the white show white spruce plantations that were 20 to 40 years old. If you look at this area right here, that is the snowshoe hare pilot project. But we moved into this conglomerate right there that had just an overabundance of these acres. So we moved into that, and we started to really focus our work on that area. And this is what we saw when we came in there. You know, some of the stands, it breaks age down even more. We entered into agreements with the Forest Service and the DNR on our RTRL and asking for cross boundary collaborations with this, you know, to get these areas thinned, you know, with the whole promise that in time we're going to restore fire. What's missing on these is variable density thinning. You can see, you know, we got a picture of blueberries here. A lot of the blueberries are no longer existent in a lot of these areas, are the other fruiting shrubs. So we're looking to get into this whole balance structure about do this variable density thinning, get these other species coming up. Some of it will be the jack pine thickets like Eric was talking about. Some will be the fruiting shrubs that are non-existent from the landscape as right now. To get to the final goal on some of this, once we're done doing our brushing and our TRL grant, then we're going to move into our TFPA fire restoration grant. All of this orange are fire dependent acreages of Chippewa National Forest land inside the Leech Lake Reservation. It's expansive. It has largely 3 big areas, you know, with tricklings in other areas. There's our tribal communities intermixed among all of these areas. So it's really an issue. A lot of these areas haven't had fire in over 100 years, and in indigenous fires, they had been going on since beginning of time until Smokey the Bear said he could no longer do them. This is a picture from back in 1902 of a Leech Lake band member on the Chippewa National Forest. And you can see, look how different the forest looks versus the plantation aesthetic you have today. It's more pine oak. Yeah, this is certainly fire dependent. You can see fire scars. There's definitely open space. And I'm not a botanist. I don't know if that's a fruiting shrub or not, but I would wager there were some in this area. Now, where we're at with everything right now with this young forest, 5 to 30 years, moving into 30 to 40, inside the 70 years, now we're looking at, the regeneration, looking at intervals of fire coming in, thinning this pine out, and having these patchy openings start to exist in our project that we call SP3. Now, lessons we learned from all this is to start small. Like I said, we did a pilot project of our pine thinning to try to build it towards fire. That was a 48-acre project. But then we expanded it in to cover actually the full entire Chippewa National Forest acreages of 16,000 acres of 20 to 40-year-old red pine and white spruce plantation. So, I mean, we're doing a lot of start with a pilot, but then aim high. And all these things can tie everything together. We've talked about doing this with snowshoe hare and going across, but we have done snowshoe hare piles inside that SP3 project. And just recently, I heard that our wildlife technicians were going out and looking for snowshoe hare sign, and snowshoe hare are using these piles. They're actually using quite a few of them, and I know our wildlife biologist is really, really excited. So some of the outcomes we saw here, I mean, it does build relationships, and better management practices, because it is, I have people ask me all the time what TE is, and a lot of it, in my mind, is just saying, that everything matters. You can't just focus on the one thing. Everything is piled up on top of each other on the same acreages, and everything should deserve equal attention. So I look at all of this as tribal adaptation. All of this is climate adaptation. Our pilot pine thinning project, we moved into a 638 agreement with the Chippewa National Forest to tie that pilot project in with the fire restoration TFPA and doing snowshoe hare piles. So we're building this layered idea, and at times it's been contentious. Our Aspen TFPA goes against the grain of our local timber industry, our timber markets. But we tell everybody, I mean, everybody's going to get something, but not everybody should get everything, So I've been very vocal about not being afraid to go against the grain. Make a big decision, say something needs to change. And then don't be afraid to put your money where your mouth is on it. I know this is a quote from our prior environmental director, Ben Benoit. He said a lot of times when people come here, they look at this as a wood basket, or the Chippewa National Forest will look at it as their place of employment. And he just says, this isn't just another forest, it is our homeland. So with that, that's all I got. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Keith. So Keith, don't disappear so quickly. Actually, I'll invite Keith and Eric to come back on camera. Awesome, great. Thanks to you both. We have a handful of questions in the queue in the chat, and I would encourage everyone out there, please don't be shy. Send other questions in if you have anything. We've got over 350 of you out there, so I'm sure we'll be able to round up a few more questions. Keith, I'm going to start with you. Yeah, there was a general question in here. You mentioned beavers at one point, and so there was a question about how are beavers integrated into aspen management? What's the relationship there?
I don't remember mentioning beavers, but If you say I did, Stephen, then I did.
Okay, maybe it was just
you
a
know,
question off of someone's mind.
I mean, we look at it. I mean, you just roll with the punches, right? I mean, it's you know, I think it was Jimmy Buffett that said that. But you know, the beavers are here, and they've been here, and they dam waters, and it just is what it is. I mean, you just embrace it. You know, like I said, with kind of the whole tribal forest management ideology, everything matters. That includes beavers. I mean, and they need to be incorporated into this. And if they cut a tree down, hey, power to them. I mean, we've done the same, right?
Maybe something then more a little specific to snowshoe hare. So there's a comment that Dan Harrison, a PhD student at the University of Maine, has had a series of students study hare habitat use in managed forests, and they found peak densities following clear cuts 20 to 40 years old, with good density of hare habitat 10 to 20 years after clear cuts. Do you see similar hare density curves after your burns or stand replacing fires? You know, is there like a specific interval age where you have the highest hare use, hare habitat?
We haven't had a lot of burns yet. I know our wildlife biologist, he says back in the day when people would do clear cuts and they would shove the slash all into these very long windrows, he said those were actually really good habitat. It would give basically a freeway for snowshoe hare, but everybody's moved away from that now. And I don't know about Maine, but I know in Minnesota, the best management practices guide, now they're utilizing more and more of that slash for industrial purposes, which is constantly decreasing the amount of slash available for snowshoe hare, which gets to be a rub. What's the right thing to do?
I think, you know, from our perspective, I think we can't, that's not an answer I can give based on the work we're doing with the Hiawatha. I think in 10 years, we can start to answer some of those questions. And really, those are the things that we want to evaluate is, you know, does the type of fire actually matter? What does the response look like from different types of fire? You know, and I think one of the things where when we're looking at things, when we're seeing differences in tribal perspectives on fire, it's, you know, we're looking at different intensities of fire than the Forest Service would use as sort of their business as usual practices, changes in timing, and really changes in places where historically they wouldn't have implemented fire. And so really understanding those baselines is going to help us evaluate over time those changes and really look at, you know, do what we see here in the Great Lakes, does it sort of comport with what they see out there? I mean, that's really cool work.
Let's see, Keith, I'll go one more question for you that's specific to red pine here, and then we'll mix it up a little bit. So James Airy is a forester with the U.S. Forest Service. He's wondering if we are dealing with red pine scale in Minnesota. It's a non-native invasive insect causing widespread mortality of red pine in New England.
I haven't heard about it being here yet. I know they just recently had a forest pest workshop and I wasn't able to attend. I would wager it's on its way though. Most things are, it seems like.
Okay, back to Eric and Eric's favorite topic, adaptive management. I'll get you both to weigh in on this. So we had a couple of questions, you know, following Eric's discussion of like, what is the situation that, you know, lends itself to adaptive management? a couple of people chimed in and asked, okay, what are specific adaptive management triggers for your work? And Eric, if you wouldn't mind talking about that first, if there are specific triggers, and then Keith, I'll ask you to weigh in if you have things set up that way also.
So I guess when you say triggers, are you saying triggers as to as to when we use adaptive management, or triggers in our adaptive management process?
Second one.
Okay. So I would say we're not with this Ishkode plan. You know, we just completed it in mid 2022. It was a lot of work getting to the point where it's at, but I certainly don't, you know, obviously with any adaptive management framework, it's a living document. And I think that I don't think we've identified specific triggers across all of these ecosystems, you know, with regard to when we would burn or not burn. A lot of this landscape, you know, when we think about introducing fire back into these areas, there are places, when you look at the dendrochronology record, they were being burned every 6 to 9 years, and they haven't seen fire for, you know, 100. And so really, it's almost like we're refamiliarizing that relationship with fire, so that we can, you know, we can take all this data, and in 30 years we can look back and say, okay, you know, what worked, what didn't, did the things that we thought we would produce with these prescriptions, did we actually produce those? And, you know, like for instance, with snowshoe hare habitat in Bachelor's Marsh, we're really looking at burning the transition from the open marsh ecosystem, knocking back black spruce encroachment, but also increasing, you know, woody diversity and introducing more age class diversity along those fringes. And our assumption is that's going to really benefit snowshoe hare in those ecosystems. And I feel like we have the data to show whether or not it did, but you know, I think we will get to the point in some future year where we have identified triggers that are like, okay, when we get to you know, certain seral stages or things like that, or age classes, then we need to trigger. Or if we see ecosystems transitioning from one thing to another, or seeing reduction in abundances of hares or other species that we're monitoring, I think that's when we'll get. That was a really hand wavy answer, I know.
Keith, is there anything you would chime in for your work? Is there an adaptive management framework in place, and do you have specific trigger points for any adaptive management decisions?
I mean, I think the trigger point, I mean, we look at, you know, a lot of the management that's currently being done is not good enough. I know when we did our TFBA fire proposal, I mean, we called for mixed severity fire. I mean, and people have they've grabbed a number throughout time that you can have 10% mortality. And we said, well, why? Why can't it be more in some places, less in others? And just let a fire go through and do what it's going to do. At the end of the day, I think everything would benefit from it, you know, with, you know, industry, I guess not so much, but, you know, you can make an argument that the residual trees that you keep, I mean, they're going to grow more and everything. And I found over the years that a lot of these arguments, you can manage a forest in a million different ways, but to change how people think is tough. It's really tough. I know I told somebody at the Cloquet Forestry Center that works at the U of M, the whole idea of adaptive management, adaptive silviculture versus regular silviculture. I said, you shouldn't even call it regular silviculture anymore. Adaptive silviculture is moving in and becoming regular. So what we used to call regular in this area, I say we should call it antiquated, which doesn't make me friends with some people, but the world is changing quickly. I mean, that's, you know, that's that's the arena you work in, Stephen. You know, I mean, you know as well as me how quickly things are changing. So, and I agree with everything Eric said.
That's just a good position statement to start every answer with. Thanks, Keith. Two kind of related questions for both of you about kind of incorporating traditional ecological knowledge and collaborating with tribes. Okay, I'll ask them as a pair, and I'll ask you both to respond. So one is, I think specifically came up during Eric, your talk. If ESA consultation was required for this effort, Endangered Species Act consultation was required for this effort, how did biologists incorporate traditional ecological knowledge? Maybe I'll let you do that one first. Was ESA consultation required for your work?
No, it actually wasn't required. There was no, like I said, the nice thing about the starting point that we had is there was a landscape that the Forest Service had already identified and completed all the NEPA planning for it. And so in terms of like jumping off and thinking about how do we build on their business as usual fire, the sort of that backdrop was already there for us.
Okay, well, maybe, so then a slightly broader but related question for both of you. What are some best practices on how to respectfully reach out and encourage or facilitate collaboration with tribal nations? This person is writing from Appleton, Wisconsin. Eric, would you? Yeah, Keith, go ahead. Go first.
Actually, I was going to say, I missed your question, Stephen. I just got a warning. My network is unstable.
Okay. Well, we'll go to Eric first then. What are some best practices on how to respectfully reach out and encourage or facilitate collaboration with local tribes? And this author is coming in from Appleton, Wisconsin.
Well, I think, you know, if you're in the Midwest, I think that most tribes have, you know, pretty mature natural resource departments. And, you know, I think that to start, you know, I would connect with those staff level folks and actually understand the tribe's perspectives and needs, you know. I think that, you know, I think the desire to collaborate with tribes is noble. At the same time, I think what you'll see is that there's not a there's not a general answer to that question, I guess. You know, I think if you were to engage Keith's program versus my program, you'd see very different landscapes, very different technical capacities in different areas. And, you know, so like, you know, trying to come up with a one size fits all answer to how to respectfully engage tribes. I think the reality is that, you know, all of the engagement that we've done with the Hiawatha National Forest and Michigan State University and the University of Michigan has really been built on long-term collaborative relationships and really building understanding and spending time together. You know, I think it's really difficult to, you know, I think you gotta invest a lot of time in building relationships with tribes if that's what if you want to work with them. It's pretty difficult to walk in the door and say, hey, let's collaborate. Sometimes.
Keith, I'll give you the final word on this.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I tell people, I've been asked this before, I tell people what first thing they need to do is listen. You know, people come in, and I believe it's human nature. People come in, they say they want to work with tribes. Now there's people on one hand that truly want to work with tribes. There's people on the other hand that have a checkbox, if you will, you know, that we worked with the tribes. We had meaningful consultation with the tribes, you know, but then I would question what is meaningful. So instead of, you know, having the tribes come in and try to fit the tribal wants and desires into their box, I think if people come here and want to work with the tribe, they need to fit what they want to do into the tribal box, you know, and do it earnestly. I've been here long enough. I've gotten to be almost an old timer here. And over the years, you can tell people that want to work with the tribe versus people that are just being told they have to. The ones that are just being told they have to, I mean, we've gotten to the point where we turn them away sometimes. You know, we're like, you know, we're not just a token signatory for people, you know. But if you truly want to work, let's do it. So.
Well said. I just want to be mindful of your time and all our attendees' times. And so I think this is an okay spot to wrap. I do have some hanging questions. And so I'll reach out to you, Eric and Keith, and ask if you care to chime in on any of the questions that are still left, and we can circulate those responses to the participants. But please, everyone, join me in saying a big miigwech thank you to Eric and Keith. Great presentations, and looking ahead to our next webinar next month, I believe, is the close of this series. Is that right, Jim or Jeff?
That is absolutely correct. Yep.
Okay, so we'll be advertising the capstone to this whole adventure that we've been on for over a year. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.